This is Authentic. Hey everyone, welcome to the first episode of Authentic Q&As. I'm your host, Scott Chafian, and with me today is guest host Sunshine. Hi, Sunshine.
Hey, Scott. How are you these days?
I am doing great. I hope you're doing well, too.
No complaints. Hey, rumor mill has it that they call you Roger. Do you mind explaining that?
All right. So we're going to jump right in there. All right. Well, I guess I'm going to get you on the flip side with your call sign for those who don't know it.
Sure.
All right. So if you haven't heard my background before, I did 20 years in the Navy. I started out as a surface warfare officer before going to expeditionary. And during a deployment that was post 9/11, I was part of an organization. My ship was part of a team in the Mediterranean, that was doing some visit, boarding, search, and seizure, or VBSS, of ships that may have been carrying cargo tied to terrorist organizations. And
Wow.
I'll leave that there. And so normally under a VBSS boarding, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. And just to be really clear and sort of throw this all out there, there's things that are called contested boardings, and that's what you hear about SEALs doing and all the cool fast roping stuff. But day in and day out, members of Surface Navy are out there doing visit, boarding, search, and seizure when we have interdiction operations. So in the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf in the 1990s, that was a big one, right? When we had the oil embargo against Saddam. Sure. And then after 9/11, we had, and these things can go on in varying degrees around the world. And normally that's surface warfare guys that are doing that. Generally what happens is you find a ship and the fleet has, so the fleet meaning say 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean or 5th Fleet in the Arabian Gulf will say, yeah, this is a ship that we need boarded. And they will work with the State Department and get permission from the country under whose flag that ship is flagged, right? So I know people are familiar. They can see the name of the ship on the back and it'll give a home port. But every ship in the world is flagged under a different country. So technically it's a part of that country's structure. And the State Department goes to the opposing Ministry of State or Department of State, and they get permission to board that ship. And so now we have legal authority to board that ship. And I promise this is getting to the point here. That's the normal course of events. And there were a couple of ships that our government really, really wanted to board for one reason or another. And I probably shouldn't go into that yet. We can maybe talk about that on a future episode when I'm sure everything's cleared. But because everything I'm talking about now is open source. And these ships were under the Syrian flag, and the Syrian government refused to give us permission. And 6th Fleet said, you know what? That's fine. Go ahead and essentially pull them over anyway. And we did, and we boarded them. I was a TAO for the Evolution Tactical Action Officer. So in CIC, I was a part of the boarding party. But as an end result of boarding these two ships, the Syrian government issued a formal démarche to the UN for piracy on the high seas.
Wow.
Which, depending on your point of view, maybe we did or maybe we didn't commit by stopping a ship in international waters and boarding it. So because there are a couple of Scots involved with Authentic Media, calls got very confusing. And when my partners heard this, they said, oh, so Scott's a pirate. All right, well, he's Roger now, as in Jolly Roger. So that's where Roger came from.
Nice. I always enjoy long explanations. I think we're getting the audience ready for, as you know, I'm a retired test pilot. So you asked me what time it is, and I'm going to tell you how to build a watch, right? So
yeah, fair enough. Right. See, we could go out all day, and so I'll trunk out ourselves, because then I'm like, oh yeah, because you go to Africa and they say, well, you know, you have all these plans and programs. The thing is, Americans have watches and Africans have time. And that anyway, we could talk about foreign policy all day.
There you go.
But okay, so Sunshine, for people who don't know you,
sure.
Let's give that quick background, and then I'm going to ask. I can guess, just knowing you, but where did you get the call sign Sunshine?
We'll start off with that. So my first squadron was full of folks that needed caffeine in the mornings, and flight ops usually start early. We're talking, you know, people are showing up to work at 05, 5:30, 6 o'clock.
Yep.
And I just never enjoyed coffee, Scott. So I would show up caffeine free, but full of energy, and to probably my fault, or, basically too much, we'll say too much. So I'd show up annoyingly happy. Hey guys, who's ready to go flying? And instead of getting the good morning sunshine, I'd get a lot of shut up sunshine. So for those at home thinking it has to do with Remember the Titans, that sunshine, no, I never kissed a guy in a locker room, so that's not me. So
okay, fair. And
just to make that clear.
I was the opposite side of that coin, so you were probably getting that from me.
Getting the flack from you.
I've known you long enough now. I'm not suspicious of you as a sailor who doesn't like coffee. But anyway,
I think there's only two of us in the Navy. So, and I just what's that?
And I was just and I don't golf, so between the two of us, we are two major outliers in naval officers, I think.
Indeed. So. My background, though, I went to the Naval Academy, got a Bachelor of Science in aero engineering, went off to flight school, spent 2 years there. That's where you get into T-45s, T-34s, T-45s, and then picked up S-3s. So S-3s, a Lockheed products, no longer around, retired early 2000s. And it was a carrier-based sub-hunter, and then eventually the mission migrated into aerial refueling. So we'd be the recovery tanker. So as the fighters come back with their probably empty wings, all the bombs gone, they needed gas. We would provide them with the gas, and then they would land safely. So I did that for a little bit, and then I switched over and went to the Naval Postgraduate School and picked up a Master's of Science in Astronautical Engineering. So I got rid of the air-breathing stuff and went more with the orbital mechanics, Kepler, and all that kind of stuff, and guidance and control. So did that, and then from there shifted over to F-18Cs, and did some combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then I moved to another squadron as kind of middle management now called a department head. And I was in F-18E squadron with VFA 147. So now Super Hornets doing Iraq and Afghanistan again. And then from there, I went off and went back to the Naval Academy, my alma mater, and taught in the aerospace engineering department. So it was kind of fun motivating the kids, showing them some cruise videos when the math got too boring, if you will. So showing them things blow up and all that. So it was kind of fun.
Keeping them going, yeah.
Exactly, right. Yeah, trying to motivate them, being an aviation cheerleader at the academy. And then from there, I went off to test pilot school. And I didn't go to the Navy. Even though I was in the Navy, I went to the Air Force test pilot school as an exchange program, exchange officer, So I finished that up and then went to China Lake, which is the home of weapons test for the Navy. So VX-31. Flew out of there, and then I married a girl from San Diego, and our Twilight tour was in San Diego at the rework facility, called the Depot. And that's where they take the old broken, sick Hornets, if you will, break them down, put them back together, and then I would fly them to make sure they still worked. So that spanned about a little over 20 years, and enjoyed every bit of it. I'll say that. So that's kind of my background.
All right. Awesome. Well, and I will give a little bit of a plug if you want to hear more about Sunshine in the test pilot in the test pilot role, you can look into our series Test Pilot on Authentic Media. But with that, that leads right into our first question. So we are doing today questions from listeners. And if you have a question, you can submit it to questions@authenticmedia.io, but we'll just go ahead and jump right in. The first one, Sunshine, is why do carrier aviators do their first carrier qualification, or CQ, without an instructor in the plane?
Well, Roger, that's a great question, because all of my 2 years in flight school, every phase starts out with a guy in your back seat, right? Your instructor pilot or IP or on wing, sometimes they call him, kind of a shepherd that's going to make sure that you are competent and a tad proficient maybe in the process. And then he's going to jump out and you get to do the rest of the phase. We'll call it solo. The one exception to that rule is going to be carrier qualification, just like the folks had asked there. So with CQ, you're going to do field carrier landing practice, or FCLPs, and you'll do them not with someone in your back seat. And I'm sorry, now this is at the field, and we have a specific box that's the dimensions of the landing area of the carrier. It's painted on the runway in the very beginning of the runway on the left-hand side. And there's an optical landing system, OLS, or what we call meatball, right? That's there. So we had the visual landing aids apparent and available for us. And then instead of having an IP behind us, we actually have an LSO, a landing signals officer, who's next to the runway. So he's on the ground and he's watching us very closely as we do all of our approaches. So the learning doesn't actually come in the jet real time. The learning comes during the debriefs afterward. So the IP is once again the LSO who's on deck and he's watching us come in and he debriefs us, Now, what happens though is when we go out to the boat, you're absolutely right. We go out solo. We usually go out in a 3 or a 4 ship. So we'll have an instructor who's going to lead in a separate plane, and then two or three chicks, we'll call them, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason the Navy has us go to the boat solo for the very first time is twofold. The first one is going to be the three little letters that you know so well, Roger, ORM, mm-hmm. right? Operational Risk Management. So without being too dramatic, basically, if the pilot were to crash and perish, they don't want to lose the instructor pilot too. So they're trying to minimize the risk or really minimize potential loss. So that's one reason. And the second reason is it's kind of a rite of passage. So, mm-hmm. A guy lands on a carrier for the first time, and if there's someone in the back seat, he may have been giving him some sugar calls, a little love on the ICS, or may have been riding the controls a little bit. And they don't want in the student's mind at any doubt that the student did it himself or herself the first time landing on the carrier. So kind of ORM and rite of passage are the main reasons that we go CQ for the CQ first time solo.
Okay, that's awesome. And I had sort of guessed the risk factor was one, but it hadn't occurred to me. So that's fascinating that both from the certification standpoint, you want to know that's that pilot, and that pilot wants to know too. So that's fascinating, because I recall doing stuff. Not trying to equate them at all. It's not quite the same, but the first time when you're getting qualified to be an officer of the deck at night or at all on a ship, right? You're doing a lot of under instruction watches, and by the end, your instructor officer's just there and you're doing everything. But yeah, it's such a different feeling the first time the sun comes up after you've been on the bridge and you've been doing this. You're like, all right, I had the ship all night long, so I hadn't even thought about that. But I can see that huge confidence boost.
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right. Well, next question we've got is, why haven't there been many, or I'd say any, I can't think of any right now, swing wing or variable geometry military design since the late 70s and 80s? So, for example, the F-14, the British Tornado, the Russian now Su-22.
Yeah, so great question. So when it comes to variable geometry wings, well, let's step back a little bit and let's figure out what's the forcing function, the demand signal, the requirement, right, for this. Mm-hmm. And it turns out that the aircraft, they were multi-mission. You had mentioned the F-14. So let's talk about the mm-hmm. F-14. It's got missions that it needs to execute at high speed and low speed. So high speed, you can imagine F stands for fighter. So I'm thinking of aerial mm-hmm. combat or really intercepts, right? So it's got to move quickly during the intercept phase of a air-to-air engagement. But now when it comes to slow, the carrier, when it's landing on the carrier, it wants to be relatively slow to make it easier to handle, if you will, to come aboard. So they wanted a relatively slow approach speed. Also, when it's loitering, so if it's on combat air patrol and it hasn't been vectored toward either a bogey or a bandit, and it's just kind of hanging out airborne, it's traditionally slow speed also, trying to maximize fuel, right, or fuel economy, I should mm-hmm. say. So the carrier approach, as well as the loiter conditions, make for excellent slow speed missions, if you will. So now you have this F-14 that's supposed to do well at high speed, and it has to do well at low speed. So, Scott, are you familiar with something called L over D max?
I'm not. L over D max. What is that?
Okay, so when you measure a wing's efficiency, there's a lot of different metrics. Right. Mm-hmm. And so one we're going to use here is L over D. It's a fraction or a ratio where L is lift and D is drag. So when it comes to wing performance, lift is good and drag is bad. So you can imagine with that ratio, with lift in the numerator, you want to make the lift as big as possible to make the overall mm-hmm. fraction as big as possible, or make the drag as small as possible, because that's the denominator, right? So mm-hmm. L over D max. So if you graph L over D max over basically zero airspeed up to, say, Mach 2 or 3, you're going to notice that there's a decrease in performance as you get faster in the subsonic region for straight wings. So what that means is 200 knots, maybe close to 300 knots, straight wings are going to be very efficient. They can be very efficient. Okay. So kind of slow mm-hmm. speed maneuvering, we'll call it. But now when you get into the transonic region, so we're looking at Mach point, say 9.5 to 0.99, there's this shock wave that forms, and it causes a lot of drag, and so that L over D goes down. So what will happen is you want to keep the wings tucked inside of the shock wave. So the best shape, believe it or not, is actually a delta wing, or kind of little triangles, if you will. Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So that'd be transonic and then into supersonic. So, so along those lines, they said, well, if we could have straight wings when we're slow and canted or really swept wings when we're high speed, how do we do that? And they came up with variable geometry wings.
Okay.
So it's going to be it can be very efficient based on configuration at the slow and the high speed regime. But as you can imagine, there are some cons. All right. So yeah, so these cons with the wing sweep, if you will, let's talk about ordnance. So the F-14, it was eventually they strapped bombs to it, right? But beforehand, it was just air-to-air missiles, right?
Right. Not a pound for air to ground originally.
There you go.
Right. Yep.
Exactly. So now imagine strapping missiles or ordnance really to the wings, and then the wings move. So pylons are going to be complicated, right? There's going to be a lot of aerodynamic interference there and all that. So it turns out on the F-14 anyway, they could only strap ordnance via hard points, right, to what they call the glove, which is kind of the shoulder, we'll call it, of the swing wing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So for the listener, when you look at an F-14, generally you've got the weapons in the tunnel between the engines, but the shoulder, those two, or there's one in with a cranked stub right outside the landing gear, right? Those are the ones you normally see a Sparrow and a Sidewinder.
Correct.
Two Sidewinders.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
And if you were to put those hard points on the wing itself, then all of a sudden they would have to move with the slipstream too. Otherwise, they become kind of these barn doors when you sweep the wings back, right?
Right.
So that makes it a little more difficult. Now, we do have, there were some designs that were swept wings, and the hard points actually rotated with the slipstream. So they stayed oriented or fared into the wind. That would be like the Su-24, the Fencer, as well as the, you had mentioned earlier, the Tornado, right? The GR1 or GR4 Tornado. So those hard points move. But as you know, Scott, whenever you have something that moves, it can be very hard to design. It can also be very hard to maintain, correct?
Right. You're right. Anything that moves will break.
There you go. Especially in the Navy nautical environment, right? So
that's right.
Because we treat our machines harshly, I'll say that. So anyway, so the ordnance and the hard points are kind of tough. That's a limiting factor, as well as the complexity of the mechanics involved. So that would be the design and the maintenance, as we talked about earlier, for hard points. But also the mechanisms that actually move the wings, they're moving parts, so they're going to require maintenance. And do you know what we traditionally use the wings for besides lift, Scott?
Flight control?
Flight control and fuel storage.
Oh, that's right. Fuel storage.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're right. Flight control, absolutely, but also fuel storage. Well, guess what? There's a lot of gears in the F-14 that took up space that could have been internal fuel.
Okay.
So there's a trade-off. As we know, aerodynamics, or really aerospace engineering, is a series of compromises, right? So now we've lost some of our maintenance ability, if you will, or reliability, we'll call it, as well as fuel capacity. And then finally, when those wings shift, it's going to change in flight the center of gravity and the aerodynamic center of the aircraft. And if you want to, we can do a deep dive later on what those mean to an aircraft in flight. But basically, you can set something off balance or off kilter. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. So I think for the listener, it's not quite the same. Well, we won't go there right now. We'll go ahead and save that for a deep dive later.
Save that for another episode. But basically, real easily, if you think of center of gravity, it's the balance point. So if you were to take a pencil, right, and put it perpendicular to, or horizontal to the ground, parallel to the ground, and balance it on your finger, where your finger is perpendicular, the balance point is going to be your center of gravity. Now, if you were to take an airplane model and you wanted to hang it by a certain point on the wing, right, but if one point that kept it balanced, this is very simplistic, but then we would call that the aerodynamic center. So center of gravity kind of deals with the force of gravity, and aerodynamic center more deals with the force of lift, if that makes sense, as balance points.
No, it does. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm sorry. So those are kind of the cons, if you will. So then, once again, test pilot answer here, right? So when it comes to
all good,
when it comes to why we don't have them nowadays, well, our aerospace engineering has advanced, and we now are able to feed the beast, we'll call it, or basically be able to provide low speed and high speed performance via something called a LEX. So that's going to be your leading edge extension or leading edge root extension, whatever you're going to call it. It's very obvious not so much on the F-16, it's there, but it's very discreet, we'll call it. But you can notice it on the F-18 and very much so on the F-18 E and F, so the Super Hornet.
Okay, so is that the piece? Well, go ahead. I'll let you describe that.
Oh, sure. So
yeah.
if you can picture where the wings join the fuselage, we'll call that the shoulder, right? And in the shoulder, it's going to actually flare out on both sides as it leads forward to the canopy, to the front of the canopy, really, the windscreen. Right. And this, what it does is this extra lifting body or surface, excuse me, that actually at high angles of attack, it produces vortices that can add energy to the boundary layer. And once again, I think when we start talking about active flow control, we can dive into that a little bit more. But basically, Lexes provide for low speed maneuverability and stability, if that makes sense.
No, it does. So I guess we'll take the international relations major here, trying to translate for the aeronautical and astronautical engineering. I never get the term right. Sorry. So basically, we had a system where we had a lot of mechanical moving parts to get us a benefit in the high speed and low speed regime. And technology has advanced enough that we can now use either what sounds like we can use a fixed body that interfaces differently with the airstream depending on the orientation of the aircraft to actually make the airflow differently, rather than just move the wing to make the airflow differently.
100%, man. You are spot on. And the big
go back and get another degree.
The honorary degree has just been
conferred. Nice.
Exactly. And so when we talk about the design, if you really want to get to the nuts and bolts of it, it has to do with computational fluid dynamics. So it's the way that we can simulate mathematically, so with computers, how airflows work. We can characterize them, and then we can build shapes to influence, we'll call it the flow. And one of those results is the leading edge extension.
Nice. And then, and let's go back for a second, because you had mentioned boundary layer, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe boundary layer is the air that is in direct contact flowing over the wing. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. And actually, so what happens is you have, as you start on the surface itself of whatever's going through the air, let's say a car for folks at home, right? So if you notice, if you're out driving in the desert and you get this fine layer of soot all over, or sand, I guess, all over your car, or dust, you can't go fast enough to blow that stuff off. And it has to do with the fact that the actual size or granules of the dust that's clinging to your car are smaller than the boundary layer. So the boundary layer is actually the thickness of air around your car that doesn't move.
Okay.
So it's attached to the metal. I'm sorry, it's static, so it's not attached, but it doesn't move with respect to the metal. And then, and it's millimeters thick at best. And then as you move away from the metal, obviously you get the full velocity of the slipstream.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, the boundary layer essentially is not moving relative to your plane.
Correct. Yeah, and that's what's going to down the road. If another podcast talk, we can talk about how to generate lift and why stalls occur. That all has to do with the boundary layer interaction with the actual aircraft or physical shape itself.
Okay. And I'll just put in an editorial note here. Guys, if you want to hear more about the lift, the stall, and all that, let us know, because this is part of our community here at Authentic, is answering the questions you want to hear. So let us know if you want a deeper dive in the things we're talking about. We'll go there. But with that being said, so you had mentioned, sort of alluded to active flow control now being sort of the wave of the future to help maybe even do away with some of these things we're talking about. What is active flow control?
You bet. So flow control in general is just going to be flowing or influencing the boundary layer and the subsequent layers directly after, above, if you will, the boundary layer around the aircraft itself, right? So we have passive and we have active boundary controls. When I think of passive, that's what we've had for a while now. So, Scott, have you heard of vortex generators?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Little strips that aren't very big. Folks at home, if you were to Google T45, you would see on the toward the leading edge of the wings, they have these little things that you can kind of might catch your coveralls on, or cut your hand on, kind of thing. They're just little squares that are sticking up just enough that they create these vortices. And that boundary layer, believe it or not, because it's stuck to the metal, if you will, it doesn't have a lot of energy. But the air directly above it that's flowing at the slipstream at the normal velocity of the air has a lot of energy. So what they want to do is they want to add some of that energy back into the boundary layer, and they do it via a vortex or vortice.
Okay.
So they swirl. So these little tabs are kind of cocked at, they're not quite directly aligned with the airflow, and they create little vortices that grabs energy from the high, fast air that's above the boundary layer and brings it down into the boundary layer just to energize it. So that's a passive flow control. But now active flow control is pretty novel, and especially because they're trying to replace control surfaces, so ailerons or even flaps too. So all kind of, and rudders too, because they have moving parts, as we talked about earlier, right? Moving parts, they always break, right? So if we could actively control the flow, i.e. deflect flow, either by sucking it closer to the jet or pushing it away from the jet or ejecting it, then we might be able to remove or replace the actuators, so the flight control surfaces, with just these holes. And if we can do that, then we might be able to have an airplane do a roll without ailerons just by using active flow control.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So sort of bringing this question full circle, back in the 70s, when we were designing airplanes, the best way we had to optimize performance across multiple flight regimes was to basically vary the geometry of the wing, a la F-14. And as time has gone by, we found ways that we could affect that without moving parts, which add complexity and maintenance issues. And they, like we said, they break and they take the space that fuel could be in and all these other things. So that's where we get to where we are today. And then the future is maybe even doing away with some or all of the parts that go into those flight controls that we're all familiar with, the flaps, the ailerons, the rudder.
100% correct. Yeah, the benefits there of the active flow control would be the lightweight. So they're called actuators or effectors anyway. These things that either eject the air from the aircraft or suck it back in toward the aircraft. And they're lightweight. There's no moving parts, and hence they're very efficient. So they're kind of costly right now, but they're very efficient.
Okay. But, like all new technologies, they're costly, but we're going to figure out a way to make them cheaper and make them reliable. All right.
You got it.
Awesome. Well, that was a great answer to that question. Learned a lot just in that one question. So let's change gears a little bit from aircraft to a weapon. And we're recording this just a couple weeks after the much publicized shoot down of a foreign spy balloon. We'll just leave it at that. By an F-22 with an AIM-9X. And we've had a lot of people ask, well, wait a minute, this balloon has essentially no propulsion, and it probably had a power supply for whatever its payload was. And the media has said it was shot down with a Sidewinder, specifically an AIM-9X. How does a heat-seeking missile home in on something that doesn't generate that much heat?
Great question. And let me say, firstly, Scott, I love the AIM-9. So it was actually the birthplace of the AIM-9 is China Lake.
Very nice.
Yeah, so there's a federal employee, William McLean, who was dabbling at the time. This would have been the late 40s, early 50s, with, hey, what kind of a heater or heat-seeking missile can we have? So a couple iterations later, they came up with the AIM-9, and since 1957, it has been the staple air-to-air weapon for us in the visual arena. So, roughly within 10 nautical miles or so. So it's quite an amazing weapon, I'll say that. Now, when it comes to heat-seeking, today's technology, so especially with the 9X, they use something called an imaging infrared focal plane array. So it doesn't have to be a bright source. It just needs thermal contrast. So what I mean by that is we call it delta T, so basically a change in temperature, right? So we need some kind of thermal contrast between the background and the object. Well, if this object is up at 60 to 65,000 feet, like the one over South Carolina, it's got a very cold background, if that makes sense.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, there's very little temperature to the atmosphere at altitude, sure.
Exactly. And then the sun is going to reflect off, some of the sun's energy will reflect, albedo, they call it, will reflect off of the balloon, as well as all the instrumentation underneath it, all the, not the solar panels, but the satellite dish or the comms, suite, as well as that thing had propellers, I believe, and all that. So basically, with respect to the sun, it's shiny. And so what happens is that's going to be a thermal contrast, right? So the AIM-9X, the sensor is so sensitive that it can actually pick up very small changes in thermal contrast. And so it was actually, I won't say it's easily able to see it, but when it comes to guidance, I wasn't surprised that it could hit it. I'll tell you what I was surprised about, Scott, was the kinematics of it.
Okay.
And
how so?
And so what I mean by that is you have this balloon, this relatively static object up at 60 to 65,000 feet. And I'm pretty sure, and this is all unclassed, that the AIM-9X, the flight envelope for that thing hasn't been tested up to those altitudes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the F-22s, there were two of them out there, Frank 01 and Frank 02, which I guess was homage to the American fighter that shot down a bunch of German balloons.
That's right.
Yeah,
Frank Luke, if I believe right. And in fact, we're working on talking to somebody who has some I won't say inside. We're going to sort of describe that in a future feature.
Oh, fantastic. So anyway, that F-22 was up at Mach 1.3, up at 58,000 feet, and he lobbed that missile up at the thing that's 60 to 65,000 feet. So I'm just impressed. Once again, I could see the seeker working, but I'm impressed that the kinematics, so basically the physics of it getting there, worked out well.
Okay.
So
cool. Not cool.
No.
Or contrast with cool, right? That's the whole point. It
was like a public test, if you will, of a new capability, I thought. So, and the other nice thing, I was going to say, sorry about, so there's a couple missiles they could have looked at, or they could have, some have asked me, hey, why didn't they shoot it with a gun? Right. So if you look historically, back in 98, the Royal Canadian Air Force had an errant or kind of rogue weather balloon that was theirs, and it was in their own airspace, but they wanted to get rid of it. So they launched an F-18 to go shoot it down. And this balloon was much lower. It was, I guess it would bounce between 27,000 and 37,000 feet. So this F-18 goes out, finds it obviously, and then strafes it and sends about 1,000 rounds downrange at this balloon. But the bullets were so small, they just put little holes, and it was such a slow leak that it didn't bring the balloon down for another 6 to 7 days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So kind of lesson learned out of that was shooting something, nowadays balloons, shooting them with guns really isn't terribly effective. Plus, you also have the hazard pattern, right? So let's say one bullet hits the payload below the balloon and stops flying. All 999 that keep going on, they're going to land somewhere down below, right? So
they're not reaching escape velocity; they are hitting the Earth somewhere.
Exactly. Yeah, they're totally coming back to Earth with a vengeance too, right? So you got to watch out below. So hazard patterns are a big deal too. So when they finally looked at bullets and they had that story, lessons learned from the Canadians, and they also looked at an AMRAAM, which is a radar guided missile, and they decided, well, it's got longer range, so its hazard pattern is actually bigger because if it misses and goes further away, you've got bigger issues, right?
Right.
So they settled on the F-18. They settled on the AIM-9. And I've only fired one AIM-9, but I can tell you the amount of confidence in that weapon that it was cued to the right source, or the right target, I guess, was very high because the visual representation. So in the cockpit with the heads-up display or the joint helmet-mounted cueing system, we have a circle that replicates where the seeker is looking. And so we can we can lock up a target with radar, and we get a little target designator box or TD box around the target. And then we quite literally just with the aircraft, we pull the seeker, put the circle basically on the square. And when we hear a tone rise, so there's a growl that comes, an audible frequency change, that we know that it's locked, and we can kind of confirm or correlate that it's locked on the right target. And then we fire or pull the trigger.
Nice. Yeah. So that's cool. Cause I know, like you said, I think you said 57. So, a missile that's been around like longer than many people listening to this podcast have been alive.
Amen.
Most people listening to this podcast have been alive, and is still out there doing it for the U.S. and our allies. And that's pretty cool. I think that's pretty cool to hear that it's gone from just purely let's find a heat source and I got to be in a rear quarter, right, and all this, to essentially an imaging smart weapon.
Yeah, it is. And the AIM-9X, it's all aspect too. So once again, you don't have to be behind the target like you're saying, looking for a huge IR bloom. And it's got some wicked maneuverability too. So besides the little control vanes it has on it, kind of little mini wings to move it around, it's got basically vectored thrust on the front. So it's got these propulsive ports that can actually cause it to do crazy turns, which is kind of cool.
Nice. Okay. Which with a balloon is probably not that big a deal, but when your target is a potentially supersonic maneuvering fighter, you want every edge you can get.
Exactly right. You got it.
Okay, so let's take that great answer to the question And let's go to another weapon. And you had mentioned the AMRAAM as a potential, and there were reasons to go with the Sidewinder, the AIM-9. So our question from a listener is they've heard about the Meteor missile that is used in Europe, and how is that different from an AMRAAM? And I think that what they're getting at from the way the question was written was more about the range, because radar guided missiles, there's some OPSEC there too. I don't think we want to touch. But the Meteor is getting quite an open source reputation for having a pretty decent range compared to the AMRAAM. So what's the difference there?
Yeah, sure thing. So it turns out it's, believe it or not, a little heavier, but it's got something called ramjet technology. So this is the first ever air-to-air missile that's successfully incorporated ramjet tech. So going back, though, if you don't mind, we'll do a compare and contrast.
Yeah, let's.
Cool. So the AIM-120 AIM for Air Intercept Missile 120, we'll look specifically at the C5 variant. AMRAAM stands for Advanced Medium Range Air-to-Air Missile, so AMRAAM. And we're going to compare that to the MBDA Meteor. So MBDA is just a company, kind of like we have Raytheon and Boeing. It's a multinational company based in France, and the M is Matra, which is an old French company. BAE Dynamics, which is a British company, and then Alenia, which is an Italian company. So MBDA Meteor. So the Meteor weighs about 420 pounds. The AMRAAM's 335. So basically, the Meteor is about 25% heavier.
Okay.
But now when it comes to range, to your point, the unclassified range of the C5 or the AMRAAM is about a little over 50 nautical miles. And for the Meteor, it's 80 nautical miles. So it's about a 48% increase in range. And then, Scott, there's something called no escape range, if you've heard of that. So basically, if I shoot this missile at an airplane, the airplane cannot outmaneuver the missile to get away from it. So that
right, no matter what it does, it's going to be in the weapon envelope.
Exactly right. Yeah. So for the AMRAAM, the unclassed range is about 19 nautical miles, and for the Meteor, big difference here, it's 32 nautical miles. Okay. So that's the no escape range is about 68% greater, almost 70% greater. So that difference in range, whether it be just the stick, we call it, right, of 48% greater, or if you look at the no escape range of 68% greater, it's predominantly due to the propulsion. And so when it comes to the C5 or the AMRAAM, it's a single stage solid fuel rocket, meaning it's just like your Estes rocket, right? It's got stuff on board, it's got an oxidizer, and when I say stuff, I mean hard matter, because it's a solid fuel, and you just light the candle and it goes, right? Now, it will burn out mid-flight, and then what happens is it's basically now just a guided projectile, almost like an artillery shell, but it has an explosive proximity fuse on it, so it has to get within the vicinity of the target, and then it detonates, and good things happen to the bad guy, if you will.
Right.
Now, on the Meteor side, it's two-stage, so you have your initial solid fuel rocket booster. So it's going to boost it up to a supersonic speed. But then at a certain point, the ducted ramjet takes over. Are you familiar with ramjets?
I am. Yeah. But let's sort of give a quick thumbnail for the listeners.
Okay, cool. Well, the nice thing, earlier we talked about moving parts and how moving parts break. Well, the ramjet doesn't have any moving parts. So for the folks at home, if you think of your car engines with suck, squeeze, bang, blow, right? So jet engines, they have compressors to do the sucking and the squeezing, if that makes sense. Well, and a compressor consists of spinning radial fans, if you will, compressor stages. Well, the ramjet...
Those are the big fans you see on your airliner when you're in the terminal at the gate waiting. You can see down the engine. Those are the compressor blades.
Exactly right. So what will happen with the ramjet is it has no moving parts. So literally, it's just the air that's being rammed into the front of it is going to slow down, it's going to be compressed, and it's going to be heated up. And that's due to something called this adiabatic. Basically, it's a very efficient process. So the air is slowed down, it's heated up just by the mere physics of being shoved into the front of the engine. And then they add fuel to it, and boom, there's an explosion, and the thrust comes out the back.
Okay. And so basically you have a secondary engine with, again, the no moving parts and all the benefits. And am I right that ramjets are also better at higher speeds?
They are, yeah. So they have to at least be supersonic. That's kind of the rule of thumb.
Okay.
And then there's a point where you can have a scramjet, which is supersonically controlled ramjet, and we can talk about that at a different episode. But for this purpose today of this discussion, the Meteor actually can throttle, believe it or not, its solid fuel propellant in the ramjet phase, if you will. And it maintains about a steady Mach 4 as it's running downrange, unclassified.
Right. So that makes a lot of sense in why it can do this, and why not just the range, but the no escape envelope. Did I have that right? Did I have that term right?
You do, exactly right. Yeah. So
so to take it back to a surface warfare analogy, we use, again, keeping it unclassed, the SM-2 and SM-4 are our surface-to-air missiles, and they are just that rocket-propelled missile that you were talking about. So we have to be aware of the fact that when we launch those, they are, once the rocket motor burns out, that is the highest energy state they will ever be at.
Yeah.
And so the further downrange they go, the less energy they have, and every time they maneuver, they lose some energy, which means the further out they go, the less effective they are against a maneuvering target. So if I'm hearing you right, the Meteor can keep its energy state up longer, which means that's what leads to that longer no escape range.
Correct, you are 120% correct. Yeah. So that is exactly right. And for the folks at home, so the AMRAAM though, so we're talking about effectiveness. And so when you compare them side by side, although heavier, the Meteor has a bigger stick, right? A longer range.
Right.
Yeah. So basically because it has this second stage ducted ramjet that provides additional energy, so the kinetic energy will stays high longer, right? Which leads to longer range and greater no escape envelope, if you will. So
all right.
You were spot on there. Yeah. And then when it comes to the Meteor though, it has never been combat proven. So whereas our AMRAAM, we've shot down MiG-21 fish bed, Sukhoi 30 MKI. And then back in 2017, our listeners probably heard of this, but there was a Navy lieutenant commander, call sign Mob, from VFA 87, who shot down a Syrian S-22 fitter. And he ended up, he squeezed off an AIM-9 first, and it was defeated by flares. And then he squeezed off his AMRAAM, and sure enough, splash one.
There we go. All right. So I guess on that, we've got the plucky new contender with a lot of reach, but we've still got the grizzled veteran with the history we know we can count on.
Exactly right. And I would say the only weak link to the Meteor missile is going to be with a ramjet. You need a certain density and a certain speed. So if you go subsonic with a ramjet, it no longer, basically that suck squeeze part of the equation no longer happens. And so you lose propulsion. So it's very sensitive to speed. And then the amount of air that gets rammed in the front is also critical. So density is a factor. So you can't fly as high you can't shoot as high the Meteor as you can with an AMRAAM.
Okay. Yeah. That's a good point. So sounds like a really good technology, but as with everything, there's pros and cons.
Amen.
All right. Awesome. All right. Well, moving on, we have a question that was very specific to you.
Okay.
Which is, of the aircraft you flew, including ones you flew maybe only as a student in test pilot school, what was your favorite aircraft to fly and why? And I called a little bit of an audible on this question. This is my own input here, which is, if you need to give us two or three, because either they're good because of different reasons, or because it's hard not to love an aircraft. I imagine, I'm not a pilot, but I'll go back to ships or boats or weapons or whatever. It's hard not to love the one you have a lot of hours on because you're so comfortable with it. So with that being said, what's the one or maybe two aircraft that you most enjoyed flying?
Well, Scott, Roger, you hit the nail on the head with the F-18. I've always loved that, but I didn't fly at test pilot school. So that aside, the rest of the airframes, honestly, because I got maybe 1 to 2 hours in them, except the F-16 and the C-12, and I got 10 to 20 hours in there. It was, honestly, each flight was filled with wonderment and confusion. So what I mean by that is I'm trying to figure out up from down. I'll tell you what, of all the aircraft I flew, I think it was close to 30, the hardest part for each and every one of them was just starting them up and getting them out of the line. So,
really? Okay.
And what I mean by that is getting the navigation system running, the radios, the flight, the hydraulics, if you will, and all that. Because basically, once you took off, it was all the same. You pull back on the stick, the trees get smaller. You push forward, the trees get bigger, right? So aerodynamics are kind of the same. but it's the systems themselves and trying to get it online in a expeditious manner so you have plenty of gas to go do your mission, if you will. So
okay.
That aside, though, my two faves are going to have to be the F-16, and it was a Block 30 or 40 or something like that. Anyway, it had the bigger engines, the 220, the bigger engine, the 220.
Right.
And man, I'll tell you what, that thing was a rocket ship. And it has this high visibility canopy that's a single piece, and you're reclining in there. It's like a 30-degree tilt, I think, on the ejection seat. So you're maxing and relaxing. You feel like you're on literally the tip of the aircraft. There's so much visibility and then the power. So as you take the active duty runway, you stop for a second and you run up the engines to check kind of oil and hydraulics, if you will. You cannot go to full power as in military, not even afterburner, because the brakes are so good and the engine's so big that the rubber of the tires will actually slide on the steel wheels, if that makes sense. So you can't go to full power.
Yeah. So the tire will actually start to rotate around the wheel itself.
Yeah. So you get some rubber rubbing, I guess. Yeah.
So almost a skid not on the road, but a skid on your wheel.
Yeah.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy? So just to give you an idea of the kind of unbridled power of the F-16 with the 220 engine. So anyway, so you run up to 90%, you do your checks, and then you go full power and take off, obviously. Now at Edwards, we have this north-south runway. I think it's runway 3517, whatever. But it's north-south flow, and it's almost 6 miles long. I mean, the shuttle used to land there. That was an alternate spot for the shuttle. Anyway, so it's a crazy long runway. So we do something called an unrestricted climb. Or a low transition. So picture, we just release the brakes. We start rolling. We get to our takeoff speed. Let's say it's 150 knots, whatever. You pick up the aircraft to about 200 to 500 feet off the ground, bring up the landing gear, the flaps automatically retract. And then you're basically off to the races, and you got another probably 4 miles of acceleration straight ahead. And so by the end of the runway, I sometimes would be up at 450 to almost 500 knots. And then I just pull back on the stick and go straight up and just aim for the moon.
Just up. Wow.
And it was ridiculous. And then once we're up,
the Shelby Cobra of airplanes.
It was. So I love Shelby Cobras. Don't get me wrong. For me, it's the Corvette. So it's kind of the 70s. What is that? A C3 Corvette, I think, or C4 maybe.
Yeah. Like with the big block.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The first Stingray, right? It was totally the first Stingray. So, golly, that was just a kick in the pants, man, every flipping time. And then once you go up and away, so that's kind of a clean, and flying away. They had something the engineers call relaxed static stability. And all that means is the nose doesn't want to, it's inherently unstable. So you got a digital fly-by-wire, and as folks at home probably know, there's maneuverability and there's stability, and they're inversely proportional. So if something is more maneuverable, it's less stable. If something's more stable, like an airliner or a tanker, it's less maneuverable. Well, this thing, they put all their money on the maneuverability side. So it was inherently unstable, but we did have flight control computers to help us along. But what it did is it provided crazy G onset rates. So you guys probably heard that this thing is rated at about 9 Gs, right? The F-16.
Right.
But, and sustained G, it hurts. I call it the pain cave. But the thing that was so much a kick in the pants was actually the G onset rate. So how quickly could you go from 1 G to 9 Gs? And basically, I think you can do it in about a second. It had a 9 G per second pitch rate authority. So, I mean, this thing was just rage around. So it was, needless to say, a lot of fun.
Yeah. Awesome.
And then, let's see, kind of geeking out a little bit here. So when you're up and away, it's G command. Yeah. So when I pull on the stick, and the stick doesn't move very much. It's more like you're influencing the stick. You're going to command a G rate. So you pull back or, influence back, and you pull 3 Gs or 5 Gs or whatever. And then when you drop the gear, it's a pitch rate command. So now when I pull the stick back or influence the stick back, it actually increases the nose pitch rate up. Not the nose position, but the pitch rate, how quickly the nose is moving. So where that comes into play, especially for new guys like myself in the F-16, is you're raging around thinking about G commands, so you get very comfortable with how the plane flies very quickly. And then you drop the gear and you come into land, and the Air Force guys, they flare to land, right? So flare to land, squat to pee. So anyway, but they come in, they flare to land. And what'll happen is when the back wheels touch down, the front, naturally, as you can imagine, starts to come down, right? So in a flare, starts to come down. Well, the computer is manually, it's commanding pitch rate, and now the pitch rate is decreasing, which was not commanded. So the computers will compensate for that. And at the same time, when I see that the nose is coming down, I naturally pull back or influence back on the stick. And so what happened, Scott, on that 6 mile long runway, at least for my first couple touch and goes, I actually probably did 3 or 4 touch and goes. So I actually bounced the F-16 down the runway 3 or 4 times.
Not deliberately, not intending to go in.
No, exactly. Just because my brain was not trained for this kind of stuff. So, let's just call that was one slice of many slices of humble pie at the Air Force Test Pilot School. So anyway, F-16. Cool. And then the other one on the civilian side was the Extra 300. Are you familiar with that?
I'm not.
Okay. So it's a little, if you guys have heard of Patty Wagstaff, or it's a very well-known plane. She is a very well-known stunt flyer, but also she was well-known for her maneuverability, or aerobatic, in the Extra 300. So this is a little, not a kit plane, but it's a tiny thing, but it's got quite a beast under the cowling there. It's got a 300 horsepower Lycoming engine. So it's a prop.
Okay.
It's got a big bubble canopy on it. It's highly aerobatic. And traditionally, it's known as an experimental aircraft. So if you guys dive in FAA, we can talk about what that means and all that. But basically, it's very maneuverable. It's rated at 10 Gs if you're single piloted. Now, I had a dude in the back, so we were rated to 8 Gs, which is still plenty. And in this thing, we did an outside loop. So lots of negative Gs. So if you can picture the normal loop, so I'm flying wings level, I pull back on the stick, the nose starts to climb, I continue to pull back, the nose continues to climb, or pitch up until eventually I'm upside down, and then I finish out the loop, right, with basically my head pointed toward the middle of the circle at all times. Well, imagine starting that maneuver again, except you roll upside down and you execute the loop by pushing. Does that make sense?
Okay.
So my feet are always pointed toward the middle of the circle. These are vertical circles, sorry.
Gotcha.
So it's an outside loop. They call
I gotcha.
Yeah, so outside basically instead of having the G-forces pull the blood out of your brain, it's now the G-forces are pushing the blood into your eyes and your brain. And so we had stupid human tricks, and we tried to see how many negative Gs we could push in this case. And I think I got close to 4 Gs, negative 4 Gs, and it was painful.
Well, because everyone talks about, gray out and blackout. And I think I told the story when you and I talked first on Fight Sod about my one and only, flight in a Prowler and graying out. But I think people don't realize I know what we called it when I went through the abbreviated water survival to do that is red out from negative G. Like more blood to the brain is not always good.
I totally
like there is too much. Yeah.
It's so true. Yeah, it can be debilitating red out. You are spot on. So the outside loop anyway. Yeah, excuse me. Yeah. And then the other thing, have you ever heard of a Lomshavak?
No.
Okay, so this is I think it's a formal term, maybe not, but a Lomshavak came from a Czechoslovakian term, or from the Czech Republic anyway. There's an airshow pilot who did some crazy tumbling maneuver, we'll call it. And once he landed, they asked him, dude, what did you call that thing you just did? It seemed kind of physically impossible. And he jokingly called it the Lomshavak, which apparently means headache in Czech. So, but basically, for the folks at home, think of it as it's an exchange of aerodynamic into inertial and back into aerodynamic forces. So what I mean by that is the airplane's flying, and then it starts to tumble, and then it pops out flying again. So a better description would be you're flying along, wings level, you chop the power, you full power, and you pitch the nose straight up. So now you're aimed toward the moon, going straight up. Well, eventually you're going to run out of airspeed. And as you start to run out of airspeed, there's kind of this gyroscopic precession, but basically the propeller and the engine work together to twist the airplane. And then as the wings stop working, because there's no air flowing over them, going zero airspeed, it starts to twist the plane, and then the plane starts this tumbling over all 3 axes, around all 3 axes, X, Y, and Z, right? And it actually tumbles, and then eventually the nose will, on its own, seek nose low because of the heavy engine in the front. And as it seeks nose low, the wind starts to work. The air starts to flow over the wings again, and then it starts flying again. And so it's this weird tumbling thing that sometimes you'll see at air shows called the Lomshavak. Oh, you're muted, Scott.
Whoops, there we go. Yeah, I've seen that at sorry, I'm trying to avoid the dog barking in the background.
Okay.
But I've seen that at air shows, and I didn't know that's what it was called, but it's pretty cool to watch, and now I understand what's going on that causes it.
Dude, it's crazy. Now, I was totally a passenger. I am not that great of a pilot to do anything correctly the first time, especially a Lomshock. So at home, if you guys want to Google it, it's LOMCOVAK. So LOMCOVAK. Lomshock.
Okay.
Yeah, crazy stuff. So anyway, so that's a long answer to the F-16 and the Extra 300 were my favorite planes at test pilot school.
All right, awesome. Our next question is about why aircraft development takes so long now compared to back in the day. And I'll just say it's timely. Someone just sent me a picture of, I think, every Grumman product from the F3F that preceded the Wildcat, the biplane F3F, to the F11 Tiger, which preceded even the Tomcat. So about 1932 to about 1953 or so, about 20 years, and we went from a biplane fabric wing, I think, still fighter to, I believe, the F111, or I'm sorry, the F11 was supersonic, maybe only in a dive, but either way, in about 20 years. Whereas now we're looking at these hugely long aircraft development times. So that is an incredibly long answer, and I am just going to recommend we have a series called Test Pilot with Sunshine, and that will give you in the cockpit as this testing goes on, and it'll be a great example of what goes into all the aviation development and tests that take so long these days. And also we'll be coming out with some ongoing product on the B-21, the Raider, as it goes through those test phases sort of in real time. So with the listeners' indulgence, we're gonna push off on that one and move on to a Navy-specific question. And that is, what do the letters on the tails of Navy aircraft mean? And so, if you don't know what I'm talking about, all Navy carrier aircraft have a 2-letter sequence on both sides of their tails. And we're going to focus on the Navy here. The Air Force has them, and they do something different with theirs. And we can talk about that in a future Q&A episode. But Sunshine, what do those letters mean on the tail?
Hey, thanks, Scott. Yeah, so there's traditionally for the fleet guys, so that would be the fleet aircraft that are traditionally gray, right? You'll have a 2-letter code there. So that would be Alpha Bravo, November Echo, whatever. And those are specific to the air wing. So we have we call them CAGs, right? The commander of the air group or the air wing, if you will. So we have roughly 10 different air groups, air wings, excuse me. And for example, the first letter is going to be either an A or an N. And the A are for the East Coast guys, so Atlantic, if you will. And then the N is for the left side of the country or the West Coast folks. So A and N, right? So it's not a P, it's an N. And I don't know, Scott, if you know why.
I don't. I've looked a little bit. If any listeners know and want to weigh in, I don't know why we went A Atlantic, which makes sense, and N Pacific, which doesn't. But okay.
Yeah. Exactly. And then the second letter in my example of Alpha Bravo, which is CAG 1, the Bravo is a specific air wing, and it's going to be coded that way. So air wing 1 is Alpha Bravo, and then the next East Coast air wing is CAG 3, and they're Alpha Charlie. CAG 7 is Alpha Golf. And so it's just this kind of rocket ripple of lettered designations that become a number designation, CAG 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. It becomes a letter designation.
Okay, cool. And then that will be on all aircraft for that air wing, right? Like it doesn't matter if and we don't have as many airframes as we used to back in the day, but regardless of whether you're in an SH-60 or an MH-60 nowadays, or an F-18, if you're in that air wing, it's going to be Alpha Bravo or Alpha Charlie.
Correct. And then the only exception to that for fleet aircraft, and we can talk about training aircraft too, but for fleet aircraft is the fleet replacement squadrons, the FRSs, or as us old timers called them, RAGs, the replacement air groups. The VFA 106, which is out of Oceania, which is East Coast, so they're Alpha Delta. And then for the West Coast, which would be Lemoore, when I think of VFA, That's 122 and 125, and they're both November Juliet.
Okay. All right. So those are going to be consistent through an air wing, but then there's other markings. The question goes on to ask, which are the numbers on the nose, and they're repeated some places on other areas, maybe the rudder or sometimes the flaps or ailerons. What are those numbers?
Absolutely. So those we call modexes, MODEX, modex. And the modex is going to be a century series, so 100, 200, 300, 400, all the way up to 700. And each squadron on a carrier. So now let's talk a specific air wing based on a carrier. Mm-hmm. What they traditionally used to do is the fighter guys, the VF before the F-18 came around. So the fighter guys would be the 100 and the 200 series. So what I mean by that is 100 all the way up to 107 or 200 all the way up to 207. So those would be the VF fighters, if you will. And then the light attack guys were the 300s and the 400 series. But now with the advent of the F-18, FA-18, right, they both fighter and attack. Mm-hmm. So basically 100 through 400 series will all be your Super Hornets.
Okay.
And then, and then with the Growlers, right, they're going to be the 500 series, the VAQ guys. 600 will be VAW, so the E2C or E2D, as well as the HSC. So that would be the 60 Sierra Squadron. And then finally, the 700 series will be the HSM guys or the Sierra Romeo squadrons.
Right. And actually, we'll probably do a bit at some point on those helos and some of those non-F-18 aircraft and the air wing, because it is sort of fascinating how they're using those these days. And it's changed a lot, I'll say, since the time I was a SWO, when we had simply 60 Foxtrots or even SH3s on the carrier and 60 Bravos on the little boys. But talking about the little boys that are out there, so when I was on a cruiser and we'd be the air defense commander, we'd have nicknames for some of these numbers. So, the 100 aircraft, when we were doing the lineup for the air tasking order, we'd get the order at night and we'd line up where all the cap stations are going because, not sure if everyone knows, but usually in a battle group, the air defense commander is actually on the senior cruiser commander. So that's who's controlling all the cap stations and running the air defense for the carrier. But back on topic, we'd be doing those lineups and we'd have nicknames for the various numbers, such as 100, 100 would be double nuts, 111 would be triple sticks. Do those get used in aviation with the squadrons?
They do, absolutely. And it's more, it's an informal name or moniker, as you had mentioned. So we're not going to transmit on the radio necessarily, but when I'm talking to maintenance, so I'm face to face with somebody, I'm like, hey, Mo, or hey, maintenance, Master Chief, how's nuts doing, or how's 01 doing? Because within the squadron, it's almost repetitive or unnecessary to use the same first digit because they're all ones. Let's say I'm in the, VFA 2 squadron.
Right.
So I'm just going to mention the aircraft by the last two digits. So, hey, how's 6 doing, or how's nuts doing, and all that stuff. So,
right. Yeah. All right. Makes perfect sense.
Hey, Scott, what I forgot to mention is with the advent of the F-35 in the Navy, so I'm specifically at the time of this recording, I'm thinking of VFA 147, right? So they're part of CAG 2. CAG 2 on their tail, it's going to be a November Echo, basically because it's November for the West Coast. And anyway, VFA 147 used to be Super Hornets, and I flew in the Argos in 147, and my Modex was a 400 series. So the squadron stayed the same, but the planes changed. So they actually just took the 400 series off of the F-18s and they put them on the F-35s, if that makes sense. For the
no, it does. And so as we're recording this, am I right that is the only fleet F-35 the only deployed or deployable F-35 squadron in an air wing right now?
It is, yeah. The CAG 2, they call the air wing of the future. They have the F-35, as well as 3 other VFA squadrons. And they just completed a cruise and they came back relatively recently. Correct.
Okay. And so it'll be interesting to see, or maybe already, is that going to carry over? Because that was the squadron that went. Are all of the F-35 squadrons going to be 400 series?
No, I think it'll be based on wherever their original place was, the original Modex was when they were an F-18. Okay. They'll just kind of remove and replace the airframe, but keep the Modex.
Okay. All right. So with these, they're sort of neat to look at, but we do so much by link and other data transfer methods. These still have a function, not just on the flight deck, but in the air, right?
They do, absolutely. And then some of the listeners may wonder, well, why is there not a 408 or 409? Mm-hmm. And that all comes back to the transponder. And specifically, it comes back to the old transponders. New ones, you could imagine, are different. But the old ones are what we call a 3-bit register. I don't know if you've heard of that term.
I haven't heard 3-bit, but I think I know where you're going from my Link days. But go ahead.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So basically, think of a bit as being a 0 or a 1. And then a register is going to be a place for either a 0 or a 1. So it's a physical spot, right? So due to some memory limitations, they only had 3 spots for either a 0 or a 1. So if you're into binary or comp sci and all that stuff, you're going to turn out that there are 2 to the 3rd combinations, right? 2 raised to the 3rd power, which turns out to be 8. And so you're going to go from 0 as one option all the way to 7. So because of the limitation on the bit register being only 3 bits, or 3 registers, excuse me, they call it the octal system. So basically, the only numbers that are transmitted can be a value 0 through value 7.
Okay, cool. And so that's why we never used it, because for the side numbers, for the modexes, because you wouldn't be able to communicate that through the link base, through the link database.
Yeah.
There was no value for it.
Yeah, and it's kind of a historical thing based on some old transponders. Yeah. Our technology has progressed, but we let's just say we love our tradition.
We do. So I'll take a quick side note, and I'm not going to claim this is absolute historical canon, but our old service dress blue uniforms, the SDBs, were you given a reason for why we had 6 buttons on those? It's a double-breasted suit jacket, for those of you who don't know. Have you ever been given a reason for that?
No. Have you?
Yeah. What I was taught way back in the NRTC days was that we had 6 because the Royal Navy had 8. And we weren't going to be the same.
Nice.
But given the Navy's tie to tradition, I can completely believe it.
But they didn't want to be 10. We didn't want to be better than the Royal Navy.
Well, being the Navy, we're also on a budget.
There you go.
So 10 was probably
10's ridiculous.
So we just,
10, just ridiculous.
That's right. We also refuse to do those loops on the sleeve. We're going to do a star.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. We've got to be different.
So got to be different.
That's funny.
All right. So we've talked about, right. We were talking about is the use for the markings. You use them visually in flight still. Is that correct? Or is that of times gone by?
No, traditionally not. With a low-vis paint scheme, honestly, airborne with a sun glare, we'll call it, or reflection, all that, it's traditionally hard to see, except for the CAG birds or the nuts birds. So the 100, the 200, the 300. Right. They're usually high-vis, so you can see contrast. But I don't remember ever flying and using the markings on the jet for relative positioning, if you will. Now, I use the canopy versus the LAO, which is going to be the missile rack on the wingtip. There's certain positional attributes that are based on physical parts of the plane, but not the paint on the plane, if that makes sense.
Okay. And so you wouldn't use it, for example, if you had to reform on people to make sure you're reforming on the right guy.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, that's a good point. But actually, nowadays, with my helmet, it's all I electronically identify the aircraft before I'm within visual range.
Very nice. Okay, cool. Well, then this sort of moves on. We had another question, and I think it's a good segue there. You were talking about the CAG birds, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, these are the ones that are still colorfully painted, and not necessarily the old vintage, gray over white. They're still all in the tactical paint scheme, but it's either 1 or 2 planes per squadron. I'll let you clarify that for me, Sunshine. You get to mark with a colored tail with a certain number of colors. And the question is, who gets to design those and how, and why? What are they?
It's timing and the skipper. So the front office, right? The leadership, as you could imagine. So squadrons, and there's actually a Navy instruction, the OpNav instruction, OpNav Inst 5030.4 that governs all this. And it talks about how a squadron can be established, and then you can disestablish a squadron, or you can deactivate a squadron. So without getting into the nitty gritty there, but when a squadron is established, that's unless it's being reestablished with historical reach back to some other squadron, like VF-32 became VFA-32. If you guys saw the recent movie there, I forget the name of it now. It's terrible, but anyway, Yep. Devotion. I was going to say Deliverance. That's a different movie. We won't talk about that.
I was about to say the same thing too. Those are two,
we won't go there.
Two totally different movies. Kids, don't Google the first one.
We won't go to. Yes. Anyway, so Devotion. Thank you. And then in that they had a historical reference or nod, if you will, to the swordsman, right? So anyway, point to that is if you're a brand new squadron and you have no historical lineage, then the front office, within reasonable means, they can put anything they want on the tail. One thing that has gone away but was very popular with the aircrew, VX9. Did you ever see the black F4?
I know exactly what you're talking about. Yep.
Yeah, so that was definitely, and they most recently actually VX9 painted painted a Super Hornet black again. Now they couldn't put the Playboy bunny on the tail, but I'll tell you what, back in the day, VX9 out of Point Magoo, I believe, had the black F4, and it had this very well-known paint scheme that would show up at air shows, and it was, let's just say it was a crowd pleaser. And that was black with some blue stripes with white stars in the blue stripes, and then there was a plain white, Playboy bunny on the tail. And that was indeed a crowd pleaser.
I do remember. And when you say the front office, you're talking about what, the CO, XO, and possibly Command Master Chief of the squadron?
Yeah, correct. You are. Yeah. So it's traditionally the skipper and the XO, or the commanding officer and the executive officer. And then there's certain times when it is the trifecta. You're absolutely right. You bring in the Master Chief for different decisions.
Okay, awesome. And I imagine, because the question went on to ask about squadron patches, and the tail is normally a variation of the patch, if I'm not mistaken. So it's all sort of tied together.
It is traditionally, yeah. So let's think of the working week as Monday through Friday. What'll happen is on Fridays, they're authorized to wear, we call them Sierra Hotel for something hot, as you can imagine.
Right.
White suits, and they're embroidered. And those embroidered will have your name, call sign, and then a squadron. If it's not the current squadron patch, it could be a historical throwback. So sometimes we'll have Fleet Friday or Historical Friday, where they actually take the old patches, the designs, the old patch designs, and they'll wear them instead. So it's not always necessarily the thing that's on the tail.
Okay, got it. And so, in fact, I'll throw out a little bit of trivia, and I don't know how I came across this, but the Starfighters, which I don't think is there a VFA 102? I know who were the Starfighters back in the day. Let me take a quick look here.
Sure.
No, those are the Diamondbacks. Bear with me. Our editor will do some great work on this.
You're not thinking about the Darth Vader thing, are you?
No.
Okay.
No. Okay, so here we go. I'll sort of lead back into this. All right, so I do know a little bit of trivia here on this that relates to two different patches. Back in the day, VF-33, the Starfighters, were a Tomcat squadron, and their emblem was a head-on view of a Tomcat in a star with a lightning bolt across the side. And I guess that was a change to an original name. There were, I think, the Tarsiers back in the day, like Korea, maybe in Vietnam era, and they had a sort of stylized screaming monkey on their patch. And so the trivia bit is that is actually Jester's helmet design in the original Top Gun. Is the original,
Well done.
Yeah. So little bit of trivia there.
That's right. And I'll tell you what. Now, I never got to fly with this squadron, but when I was talking about patches, if you will. So if you guys look up VAQ 209, they're called the Star Warriors, and thanks to George Lucas, they have Darth Vader on their tail and on their squadron patch. VAQ 209, the Star Warriors. They're a reserve VAQ, obviously, so they're a reserve Growler squadron, and it's
nice.
Something I've always been jealous of.
Yeah, that's a lot to be jealous of. Yeah, cool. All right, so let's move on from the planes themselves, and we have a personal question, and I'm going to read the verbatim question here. It says, "Hi, my name is Cash. I'm from Greenville, South Carolina. I'm 11 years old and really want to be a fighter pilot someday. I've read a lot about the incredible things fighters can do today, but wondered what kind of training do you have to do to deal with the really high G loads? Thanks very much. All right, Sunshine. So we talked about G's a little bit earlier. Let's talk about what you guys do to deal with them and mitigate them.
Hey, Cash. So thanks for the question, buddy. And I got two things for you, cigarettes and chocolate donuts. I'm just kidding. No, just kidding. Okay.
You forgot bourbon.
Yeah, there you go.
No, Cash. Don't do any of these
No,
things.
disregard. Just kidding. Bad parent here. Bad parent.
To Cash's parents, we apologize right now.
So that actually, you bring up a great point. So digging a little bit deeper since you asked test pilot. So you got this hydrostatic column, right? It's going to be basically the bottom of it is your heart. The top of it is your brain, and your eyes are in between. The whole point of G training is to keep the pressure, the blood pressure up to your brain, i.e. kind of energize that hydrostatic column. So the way we do that on ground is we go through a series of spins in what we call the centrifuge, right? And so the centrifuge is going to basically vary G load as well as G onset rate. So G load is going to be, hey, I'm pulling 4 Gs, now I'm pulling 5, now I'm pulling 6. And they're different profiles. There's 7.5 Gs for the F-18, and there's 9 Gs for the F-16. But then there's also G onset rate, as how quickly you snatch on those Gs. And both, as you can imagine, are going to affect the blood pressure in that hydrostatic column. So we have our centrifuge, and we talked about max G and max onset rate. Now, before we step into that, we do something called G-LOC training. So G-LOC is kind of an awkward acronym, G-L-O-C for G-induced loss of consciousness. And what will traditionally happen in that hydrostatic column, your brain will, as the pressure starts to drop, the blood pressure starts to drop, you will actually start to task shed, almost like a computer does, or if your battery gets low in your car and things start going awry. So what will happen is the brain, though, is an amazing organ, right? And as the blood pressure starts to drop, things, capabilities, faculties, whatever, start to fall offline. The first one is gray out. So you actually lose color. So everything literally is shades of gray, and I've experienced that. And then from there, with the rods and cones, you lose some of those, and you're going to lose your peripheral vision. And so they call it tunnel vision. So I've seen a gray world, if you will, while flying, and I've seen the tunnel vision. And then finally, your eyes stop working completely, and I call it blackout, but you're still conscious. So it's weird. So you can still hear things on the radio. You know you're still flying. You're still aware, but you can't see. And then the final last step is going to be loss of consciousness. So with this G-LOC training, they're going to step you through all the different types, not physically in the aircraft, but they're going to talk to you about it so that you're aware of when it happens, how to recover, how to identify the issue, if you will, and then recover from the issue. So with the G-LOC training, the way to kind of prevent that from ever happening, going through that series of degradations, we'll call it, is something called the hook maneuver. Scott, are you familiar with that? Did you try that in the?
I am.
Okay. So it comes from the sound of, I guess, your glottis slapping shut. So basically, you're going to tense up all of your gut, right? And you're going to exhale quickly and try to tense up your chest too. So you get this kind of hook sound that comes out. And that's just for the reaction of your lungs as they get squeezed voluntarily, if you will. You get squeezed, right? And then it throws the air out of your lungs. So between the trapped air pressure and the increased blood pressure, ideally it'll help to pressurize the blood in your brain. So there's the hook maneuver, and then there's probably since Vietnam era, I think we've had G suits. So you strapped on a G suit too, right, Scott? I did, yeah. How comfy was that thing?
Not extraordinarily, at least, and now I will admit that, when you go as a midshipman, you don't have these things sized to you.
Yeah.
You're taking whatever's available in the squadron. So, I'm hoping maybe they were a little more comfortable, but, that was a whole lot of pressure around the lower half of your body.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's a series of bladders that will be filled with air, and the filling and the deflating. So the inflating and the deflating will be controlled by the computers in the jet, right? And the emphasis of this is to squeeze the blood out of your legs and gut to help keep that hydrostatic column energized. So basically to keep the pressure to your brain, right? So you get the hook maneuver, and then you wear your speed jeans or G suit, if you will.
Right.
And that's probably all the training really we have for high G loads.
Yeah. And really it's just it's exposure, right? Not like your body physiologically gets better at it, but you get to learn what it feels like and the when to do these things and how much you can take. That's really how you deal with it, right?
That's exactly right. You learn your body. So we, as pilots, we're very in tune with fatigue, dehydration, hypoxia, so lack of oxygen, and we learn what our kind of graceful degradation, I call it, basically what our failure modes are of, hey, I don't have enough oxygen because my mask isn't working, or I'm pulling too many G's and I'm starting to gray out. So you learn how your body responds to that, and then you learn how to fix it, we'll call it.
Right. And so, we'll go to two movie references. One is, the latest Top Gun Maverick, when, they have a G-lock incident, right?
Yeah.
And so you've seen the movie and you can speak to, is that, fairly accurate, at least as far as the onset and watching what was happening with him?
It is. And unfortunately, so I think it was Coyote in the movie who had the G-lock, or he got close to it anyway. I had a friend perish that way. So Frank Hooks, sad, terrible, terrible incident, but basically loss of consciousness, whether it be G or because of a lack of oxygen. But he ended up selecting afterburner in his unconscious state, and he flew into the water. And his wingman was following him downhill, yelling out, not his call sign, but yelling out his name on the radio, trying to wake him up. So,
is there audio of, and I'm not advocating, I maybe shouldn't even go here, but I've heard audio of this, and it was part of the push to get the automated ground collision avoidance system. So it was in a good cause. It wasn't sensationalizing. This might have been that one, but there's audio that's been played to demonstrate how horrible this is, and heartbreaking for something that maybe we can start to avoid in the future.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't know if so his call sign was Pooj. I don't know if Pooj's audio is available on the internet or wherever, but it was it's a gut check, you know what I'm saying? And that auto GCAS. Sorry. And then auto GCAS, as you talked about earlier, that was a project that was going on at Edwards when I was at test pilot school, and it has saved a lot of Vipers guys' lives, I've heard. We don't have it in the Navy, but so it's a good.
I think they might be talking about for the F-35.
Good.
Was talking with somebody else, and I don't know, but I know, and we won't get into it here, but other than for me to say, I think it can be implemented in the F-18, and some of us don't always agree with some financial decisions that the DoD makes, but we'll just leave that
there. You
go. For maybe a little bit of a lighter note, if you want to hear what this sounds like, there is video. And the video quality is not great, but the audio really comes through. And you've probably seen it, Sunshine, of an F-16 in Desert Storm. So way back in 91 on, I think it was the Q route package strike. Okay. You can Google it. I think it's Q route strike F-16. And this one F-16 had somewhere between 5 and 9 SAMs shot at him. And so the whole time you hear him evading, a stroke was his call sign. I don't remember the number, but you can hear him evading, and you can hear him, as he's maneuvering through this, avoiding, half a dozen or more SAMs. And it really gives a good feeling for how intense and how violent this is. And you can hear even his voice change as he's under G, both from the stress and from the physiological changes.
Yeah, I'm with you. That package Q strike, if you will, and I've heard that, and they play that back to us during some of our training. We'll say in the F-18, and it's just the SAM, the smoky SAM that's going to get you is the one you don't see. You know what I'm saying? So
exactly right. That's always the way. It's the one you don't see. All right. Well, Cash, I hope that answered that question for you. And so we'll move on to the next one. Hi, Sunshine. What are your thoughts on single seat versus 2-seat fighters? Does the increase in SA, situational awareness, and the avoidance of task saturation offset the possible compromise in performance?
Well, I love this question. I'm quite a social creature, let's say. So I've flown a lot of single seat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and especially at night. And my wingman's out a mile off, and you have to key the radio to talk to him. So you get pretty isolated anyway. Whereas in my test days, almost all of my major events, live fires and whatnot, high visibility events, we'll call them, had a backseater. And I loved the social aspect of not having to key the radio because you can just talk privately to the guy behind you. So, but let me offer up that usually 1 + 1 = 2. There are times when 1 + 1 = 1 or 1 + 1 = 0. And when it comes to SA, right? And I've seen all three cases, but traditionally the backseaters with whom I've flown, they're professionals. And they only augment or help or complement, we'll say, the situation, especially building SA. But there have been some times where it doesn't equal 2. Yeah, and it's a kind of this cascading failure of like, oh, geez, you forgot to do that. Now you're anyway. But
okay. So does this mean the question I've been impressed with us so far, if I could say that, because we've gone through, what is this, 10 or 8, 9, 10, 11 questions, and so far 11, and I think we finally got to the fighter pilot answer. It depends.
yes, it really does. I totally agree. It depends. It depends on the personality and the chemistry, we'll say, right there. But there are missions in the Navy that require a Foxtrot squadron or a 2-seat. Specifically, I think of the Forward Air Control Airborne, FAC-A,
right?
If you will.
FAC-A,
and it's the dude in the back that's running the show, and the guy in front is basically safety of flight and deconfliction. So I'll tell you what, my helmet exploded most though during my close, not literally, obviously, but figuratively, right? During close air support missions at night. So that would mean,
I imagine so.
Me talking to a guy on the ground and him lazing or giving me coordinates to employ to save some friendlies. And I would have loved to have a backseater to help with the management of the task saturation. Definitely was high there. So I'm still, though, I'm going to proponent. I'm going to say, even though I was Echoes in the fleet and Foxtrots in test, I enjoyed having a second brain, second set of eyes, a second person, if you will, helping in the problem.
Fair enough. All right. So last question for the day. And that is, when you were flying in the fleet, did you ever fly in a squadron that had a nuclear mission? And if so, was it difficult to reconcile your role? Also, how did you come to terms with the fact that it was potentially a one-way mission? And if knowing the S3 mission and then the time frame, if this doesn't apply, we could maybe just talk back through this generically from either people we knew who did have that mission or maybe a little bit of early surface time.
I'm with you. So all of my fleet experience, I only had one time where I thought I saw a glimpse, we'll call it, of a nuclear mission. And believe it or not, Scott, that was in the S3, not the F-18.
Really?
Yeah,
okay,
I know, crazy, dude, right?
Oh, no, I just realized what it probably was. But
you can back me up here. But basically, pilot sits in the left seat. We have a series of switches on my right and on my left. On the left, it's the outboard side of my seat, correct? And then there was actually a special weapon switch. So never used it. It was dusty, never got moved from special to, from conventional to special or on, we'll call it. But I asked the guy, and this was not in the RAG. This is now I'm in the fleet. I'm like, dude, what in the world is that button or switch? He's, that's for if you're carrying nukes. I was like, no, that's ridiculous. He's like, no, seriously.
An S3, come on. Yeah.
Because we wouldn't be escaping the blast, let's say that. So I was like, holy
cow. So I'll throw out there. So my first tour was as an ASW officer, right? And so I think, and I let me go back in time, right? So I think I got about 10 years on you here because I was year group 92. And let's see if it was drilled in well enough. I can remember it now. The Navy has just been transitioning from sort of the nudge, nudge, wink, wink. We all knew that nukes were on certain ships and other places. Sure. I'm excluding ballistic missile submarines here, right? Because of the Cold War. And we had gone to, it is not the policy of the United States Navy to carry nuclear weapons aboard surface ships of the fleet, but we do not disclose the presence or absence of nuclear weapons on board any particular asset. I think that's pretty close for having been 30 years ago.
That's some good legalese there. Yeah. So basically, we're not going to tell you.
Right. But with all that being said, going back, I believe the S3 was designed to be capable of dropping a nuclear depth bomb.
You are correct, sir. Yeah. So out of our bomb bay, right? Because that's the only plane I ever flew with, a bomb bay. It was kind of cool.
Right.
But anyway, yeah. So you could drop a nuclear ordnance, if you will. Yeah. At I don't even know the altitude. That employment, that concept of employment, the ConEmp, was so archaic. By the time I got to the S3, the switch once again was just dusty and never touched. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know.
Yep. So I think if we go back and, listeners, if you're interested, we'll seek out some people who had that mission, because I know it changed over the course of the Navy's history. So, I was right in that time frame where I went to nuclear weapons handling officer school.
Wow.
So, one of my little collateral duties, right? Yeah. Did you call them SLJs in aviation? They're we'll call them shooty little jobs to stay family friendly, right? If we had special weapons on board, then I was the guy who was going to, manage the nuke weapons handling program. And with that, you sort of got the history of it. And yeah, back in the day, guys with even things like, A4s. I don't know if the A1 Skyraider ever had it, but I bet they did. And I can't imagine anything more uncomfortable than delivering a nuke in a Skyraider, a prop-driven, attack plane. But there was a Navy mission back in the day to be part of the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operations Plan, which was sort of the national plan for if World War III happened in the nuclear war. Every carrier had their plan and their missions they had to brief and that they had to be familiar with, that they were going to fly. And that evolved over time, as my understanding went from the school to, of course, the A7 Corsair, the A6 Intruder was probably the primary example. And then the F-18 would have a nuclear mission, but that started to diminish, at least as we were taught, as Tomahawks came online. Because the original, at least as we were taught it, the original land attack Tomahawks weren't as we think about them now after Desert Storm and moving forward. The only land attack ones were nuclear tipped. And so that was where the Navy's nuclear mission was going to go.
Wow. Because so that's cool. I was totally unaware of TLAM and the nuclear capabilities, we'll say. But to me, when I first saw this question, Scott, I thought of the A4. Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great point.
So the A4 had a mission too for low altitude ingress, followed by a nuclear loft. I kid you not. So never flew this plane in flight school or otherwise. So the little scooter, we called it. So this A4, I highly recommend folks Google this. But anyway, the A4 Skyraider, or Skyhawk, excuse me, sorry about that, Skyhawk, is designed by a guy named Ed Heinemann. And he quite literally designed it on the back of a bar napkin, basically. And so they're looking for a low-cost fighter. Anyway, so this thing turned out to be, it has a crazy roll rate, and they call it the scooter, man. It gets going. It gets it done. And so these guys would practice or train to a mission where they would go low-altitude ingress to stay below the radar, and then they would do something called a half Cubanate, right? So basically a pitch-up maneuver, and as the aircraft is approaching purely nose high, right, approaching, not quite there, they would pickle the ordnance, and then it would start a momentum, basically a trajectory, it would be away from the A4. Then the A4 would continue this roll onto its back, continue further nose low, roll upright in a 45-degree nose low heading, and fly away from the intended point of impact of this bomb. And they used to have an eye patch. Did you hear about this?
I have heard about this. Okay, but go ahead.
I don't know if this is Navy lore or whatever, but never let the truth get in the way of a good story, right? So
never. And it's your story, so you tell it the way you want, Sunshine.
And full disclosure here, I never flew the A4, never talked to an A4 pilot about this, but the rumor was that if they're doing this mission, they would wear an eye patch over one eye, obviously. They would do their ingress, they'd do their pitch up, they'd lob the nuclear weapon, they'd continue the roll. And as they're continuing the roll to get on their back, they continue downhill now. So they rolled on their back, rolled upright, nose low, and as they're escaping, then the nuclear detonation would occur and it would blind, because they didn't know when it was going to happen. They assumed the intense light would blind the one eye that was exposed. When the pilots realized that, then they would remove the patch. And so that was their preemptive protection for their other eye.
That was the good eye they would have.
R. So talk about pirates, and you talked earlier, Roger.
Right, arg.
There'd be pilots in the sky.
Yeah. So, I'll go back to and I'll say right now, I think we're outside the realm of classification. I never carried nukes on any of my ships. So I don't know if Sunshine, you or I can answer, was it difficult to reconcile your role, other than to say, to some extent, maybe it's a matter of degree, right? Because, and I'm not trying to be flippant or blasé about nuclear weapons, but when you sign up to do this job, you have to be aware you might have to take life. And so I think that in terms of, wow, I might actually have to do this, I think anyone who's really thought about it when they signed up and really thought about it through the training has probably dealt with that on the micro scale. Would you agree with that?
I agree. Totally.
Yeah. Now, I don't think either of us is qualified to answer based on what we've said, that macro feeling. Maybe, like I said, if you guys are interested out there, let us know. We'll look into finding some guys who had that mission assigned. Maybe we'll even start talking to a submariner, right? Who had the ballistic missile mission, because books and movies have been written about that entire topic, right? About, you're not just talking about shooting somebody. You're not talking about dropping a 500-pound bomb on a group of somebodies. You're talking about being a part of what could arguably be the end of the world. So it's a fascinating question.
I agree. And just the last bit is, Scott, you familiar with the term broken arrow?
I am. Yep.
So the liability, it's one thing annihilating the population. Not to cheapen what you're just saying, but I totally agree with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
The other part of it, though, is just the risk involved, or the liability involved with floating around the open ocean or flying, in this case, with a nuclear weapon. And if it gets lost, so broken arrow is any time that they basically lose control of a nuclear weapon. So they don't know where it is, right? Whether it fell off and didn't detonate, hopefully, or there's a case in I think it was 1965. There was an A4 on, I think it was the Tycho, so the Ticonderoga. Anyway, they're over by the Philippines, and they're doing this drill where they're going to roll the guy with the weapon in the jet. They're going to roll him to the elevator and then bring him up to the flight deck and then launch him off, kind of like an alert posture practice. Right. And unfortunately, they rolled the guy to the elevator, and I don't know if his brakes didn't work or whatever. Basically, he went over the side. And so, unfortunately, the pilot, the plane, and the nuclear weapon were all lost. So they chalked that up to a broken arrow incident. That was back in '65. So just one example of the liability associated with just hauling around a nuclear weapon. Cool.
Right. Wow. Okay. Well, we sort of ended that on a dark note. We didn't bring this around somehow. No, all good. No, it's not you. We should have probably reordered those questions. It's talking about the A4 sort of triggered a memory for me. So let's do this. It's not a Q&A. It's not even a C story. It's Midshipman Chafian was there, right? Nice. And Colonel Helbush, if you're out there and listening, Colonel Helbush was a Marine aviator who was my second CO at my Navy ROTC unit. So if you're listening, hopefully you think I did okay. I did 20. I think I did some good things, and it was a good leader. But he was an A4 pilot, and he set up a tour for us at NAS Alameda back in the day when that was a thing, across from San Francisco. Yeah. And so we got out and we got a static display of all these different aircraft. I got to climb inside the Whale, the old A3. But they had one of the sort of maintenance stands set up next to the cockpit of the A4. And he was up there, and we were taking turns coming up. And we got up there, and he starts telling me how about back in Vietnam, to take a step back, the A4 had a very early, I don't know if it was even a HUD, but a display, right? And it had one of those early, if you can even call them computers, that had sort of a cylindrical drive, and it was sort of between the rudder pedals. And so he was telling me the story. And now keep in mind, Colonel Helbush was about 6'1", if memory serves, right? And you've seen an A4, the scooter, it's tiny, right? And so he's describing, he's going, so you'd be in a dive, essentially a dive run for close air support, danger close with Marines, and he's shooting the 20 millimeter cannon down, and there's flak coming up at him. AAA, I guess, in Vietnam, right? Not flak. And the sort of display would go out, and he's trying to stay on target, kicking this computer container to try and break it loose from the G-force to get it rolling again, and so he could get his targeting symbology. Just as he's diving down, being shot at, and he's telling me this story, and then he just sat back and he looked at the cockpit and he said something to the effect of, "You're sort of dumb when you're young." So I think Colonel Helbush loved his time at A4s, but it's funny the things you'll do when you're young. And climb into that little tiny cockpit and do that.
Young, dumb, and fearless. I am totally with you.
Young, dumb, and fearless. Absolutely. We've all been there. So, all right. Well, Sunshine, I have really enjoyed the time, as always, when we talk.
Likewise.
And again, for you listeners out there, you can get more of Sunshine on the Test Pilot series here on Authentic, and that's ongoing right now. And I think, Sunshine, you and I are talking about doing some discussion of the Block 3 F-18 here in the near future. We'll let the listener know, what does that really mean, and what's that bringing to the table for the Navy?
Yeah, the Block 3 upgrade. So I think there's 78 of them that are being produced, and VFA 113, the Stingers in Lemoore, actually have them, and I was just chatting with their OPSO earlier today for my day job, and so they're in the fleet, and they're working.
Okay. Awesome. Well, you guys can look forward to that. I think it's timely because I just read an article today that they just decided that they're going to stop new build production of the F-18 in 2025, I think.
I did see that.
They said that's going to be it. Yeah. So stay tuned for that. And if you have questions, send them to questions@authenticmedia.io. As I said, this is the start of our community involvement portion of Authentic Media, where we really want to get to know you guys and hear from you and interact with you. And next up for this at the end of March will be an author debrief. Some may call it a book club, but we chose to call it an author debrief with Kevin Miller, call sign Hoser. So if you want to pick up The Silver Waterfall by Kevin Miller, available on Amazon, read that. And at the end of the month, Authentic subscribers will get a chance to interact with myself and Hoser. So with that, Sunshine, thank you very much once again, and we'll be talking to you soon.
Sounds good. It was a pleasure, Scott. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, man.
Thanks for listening to our Q&A episode. If you'd like to hear more from Sunshine, check out our Test Pilot series on the Authentic Media platform. There are no advertisements, and you can try the first 2 weeks for free.